For more than 700 years, the samurai had ruled Japan. They were more than soldiers. They were the nation's elite, bound by a strict code of honor known as Bushido. Loyalty, discipline, courage, and sacrifice defined their lives. From childhood, they were taught that honor mattered more than wealth, comfort, or even life itself. Their swords were not merely weapons. They were symbols of identity. To lose a sword was shameful. To lose one's honor was unbearable. For centuries, powerful shoguns governed Japan, while emperors remained largely symbolic figures. The samurai enforced law, fought wars, and maintained order across the country. Entire generations believed this system would last forever. But history rarely warns those standing at the edge of change. By the middle of the 19th century, Japan faced a crisis unlike anything it had experienced before. For more than 200 years, the country had remained largely isolated from the outside world. Foreign trade was tightly controlled, Western influence was limited, and traditional institutions shaped every aspect of society. Then, in 1853, everything changed. American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry entered Japanese waters carrying steam-powered vessels, unlike anything most Japanese had ever seen. The message was simple: open Japan to international trade, or face overwhelming military force. The arrival of the so-called black ships shocked the nation. Many Japanese leaders realized that resisting modern industrial powers with medieval institutions would eventually lead to disaster. Others believed opening the country would destroy everything that made Japan unique. The debate divided the nation. Within only a few years, the centuries-old Tokugawa shogunate began to collapse. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration transformed Japan forever. Political power returned to Emperor Meiji, and an ambitious modernization program began. Railways stretched across the country. Factories appeared where rice fields once dominated the landscape. Western military advisors trained a new national army. Modern rifles replaced traditional weapons. Uniforms replaced armor. The government wanted to build a nation capable of standing alongside Europe and America. But progress always has a price. For the samurai, the price was everything. Their hereditary stipends were gradually abolished. Their exclusive right to carry swords in public disappeared. Their military privileges vanished as universal conscription created an army made up of ordinary citizens. For the first time in centuries, a farmer's son could become a soldier. A merchant's son could become an officer. The old social order was collapsing before their eyes. Many samurai accepted the changes, believing Japan's survival depended upon modernization. Others saw something very different. To them, the government was not saving Japan. It was destroying its soul. Among those who struggled with this transformation stood one of the most respected men in the country, a warrior admired by allies and enemies alike, a man who had helped restore imperial rule, only to become its greatest opponent. His name was Saigō Takamori. Even today, he is often remembered as the last samurai. Born into a modest samurai family in the Satsuma domain, Saigō earned a reputation not through political ambition but through integrity, humility, and military ability. Unlike many powerful officials, he was known for speaking plainly and placing duty above personal gain. Ironically, he had been one of the leading figures who helped overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and pave the way for the Meiji Restoration. He believed Japan needed reform. He believed the emperor should lead the nation. But he never imagined that reform would erase the very class that had protected Japan for centuries. As the new government accelerated its modernization, disagreements grew deeper. Saigō became increasingly uncomfortable with the speed of change and with policies that, in his view, abandoned the values that had shaped Japan for generations. Eventually, he resigned from government and returned to Kagoshima. Thousands of former samurai followed him. Officially, they came to study in private military academies. Unofficially, many believed they were preparing for something far greater. Tokyo watched with growing concern. The government feared that the man once celebrated as a national hero might soon become the center of a rebellion. Rumors spread across Japan. Weapons were being gathered. Former warriors were training again. The uneasy peace that followed the Meiji Restoration was beginning to crack. Neither side truly wanted war, but both believed they were fighting for Japan's future. One believed that survival required change. The other believed that a nation without honor could never truly survive. Soon, these two visions of Japan would collide on the battlefield, and one final samurai would become a legend. When Saigō Takamori returned to Kagoshima, he did not declare war. He did not raise a banner of rebellion. He did not call upon the samurai to overthrow the emperor, at least, not at first. According to contemporary records, Saigō hoped to live a quieter life away from politics. He devoted much of his time to education, helping establish private academies where former samurai could continue studying military science, ethics, and leadership. These schools quickly became centers of learning, but they also became gathering places for thousands of men who had lost their purpose in the new Japan. Many of them had once carried two swords with pride. Now they were forbidden from wearing them in public. Many had commanded warriors in battle. Now they struggled to find a place in a society that valued engineers, bureaucrats, merchants, and conscript soldiers over hereditary warriors. They felt forgotten, humiliated, replaced. To these men, Saigō represented something the new government no longer could: honor, loyalty, tradition. As more former samurai arrived in Kagoshima, the central government in Tokyo grew increasingly uneasy. Officials feared that the academies were becoming more than schools. They suspected they were evolving into military camps. Whether those fears were entirely justified remains debated by historians. While weapons were stored and military training continued, there is little evidence that Saigō had immediately planned a nationwide uprising. Yet distrust between both sides was growing rapidly, and each interpreted the other's actions as preparation for conflict. Then came the incident that pushed events beyond anyone's control. Government agents were reportedly sent to Kagoshima to monitor the situation. Some accounts claim they were gathering intelligence. Others suggest they were investigating military supplies. Rumors quickly spread that Tokyo intended to arrest, or even assassinate, Saigō Takamori before he could become a greater threat. Whether every rumor was true remains uncertain. What mattered was that thousands of armed former samurai believed them. Their patience collapsed. In early 1877, the arsenals in Kagoshima were seized by local samurai. Weapons and ammunition were taken before government forces could secure them. The crisis could no longer be hidden. Saigō now faced an impossible decision. He could attempt to stop his followers, risking chaos and division among the very people who trusted him. Or he could lead them himself. Reluctantly, he chose leadership, not because he sought power, but because abandoning them would almost certainly lead to bloodshed without purpose. Thus began the Satsuma Rebellion, the last great uprising of Japan's samurai. At first, the movement was not presented as a revolution against the emperor. Many participants insisted they remained loyal to Emperor Meiji. Instead, they claimed they wished to remove corrupt officials, whom they believed had betrayed the emperor's vision and abandoned Japan's traditional values. It was a distinction that mattered deeply to the rebels. They did not see themselves as enemies of Japan. They believed they were defending the true spirit of Japan. Nearly 13,000 samurai marched north from Kagoshima. Most carried traditional swords. Many also possessed rifles. They were disciplined, experienced, and fiercely loyal to their commander. But they faced an enemy unlike any previous Japanese army. The imperial army was young, yet it represented a completely different future. Its soldiers came from every social class. Many had never belonged to samurai families. They had been trained using modern European tactics. They carried newer rifles. They had access to artillery. Most importantly, they possessed an industrial supply system capable of replacing weapons, ammunition, and manpower far faster than the rebels ever could. The first major objective of Saigō's army was Kumamoto Castle. The fortress controlled an important route through Kyushu and served as one of the government's strongest defensive positions. If it could be captured quickly, the rebellion might gather momentum. If it failed, the rebels would become trapped in a long war they could not afford. In February 1877, Saigō's forces surrounded the castle. The defenders refused every demand to surrender. Days turned into weeks. Repeated assaults met determined resistance. Modern firearms and fortified defenses inflicted heavy casualties on attacking samurai. The legendary swordsmanship of centuries past proved devastating in close combat. But reaching the walls under relentless rifle and artillery fire became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, government reinforcements were already marching south. Railways, steamships, and modern logistics allowed Tokyo to move tens of thousands of soldiers with remarkable speed. The very modernization that Saigō questioned was now demonstrating its greatest strength. Every day the siege continued. The balance shifted further against the rebels. Food became scarce. Ammunition dwindled. Losses mounted. Still, few considered surrender. For the samurai following Saigō, defeat in battle seemed preferable to abandoning the ideals they believed defined their lives. They had not begun this march expecting comfort. They had begun it believing history itself was watching. Soon, the siege of Kumamoto would end. And with it, the last realistic chance for the samurai to change Japan's future. The siege of Kumamoto was supposed to be the moment that changed everything. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. For weeks, Saigō Takamori's forces surrounded the massive fortress, hoping hunger, pressure, or repeated assaults would eventually force the defenders to surrender. Yet every passing day strengthened the imperial government rather than the rebels. Modern Japan was beginning to reveal its greatest advantage. It could replace what it lost. Fresh recruits arrived from across the country. New rifles, ammunition, artillery shells, and supplies reached the battlefield through expanding transportation networks. Steamships carried reinforcements to Kyushu, while improved roads allowed government columns to advance faster than many former samurai had believed possible. The rebellion, by contrast, depended almost entirely upon what it had brought from Kagoshima. Every rifle lost could be difficult to replace. Every experienced warrior who fell was irreplaceable. The imperial army was learning with every battle. The samurai had fewer opportunities to recover. Eventually, government forces broke through and relieved Kumamoto Castle. The siege was over. For Saigō, this was more than a military setback. It meant the rebellion had lost its best opportunity to gain momentum before the government's full strength could be mobilized. The initiative now belonged to Tokyo. What followed was no longer a campaign of advance. It became a long retreat across the mountains and valleys of southern Japan. Imperial forces pursued relentlessly. Whenever the rebels attempted to establish defensive positions, government troops pressed forward with disciplined formations supported by modern artillery. The difference between the two armies became increasingly visible. The samurai still inspired fear in close combat. Many officers later described the extraordinary courage shown by men who charged rifle fire, carrying little more than swords and determination. But courage alone could not overcome industrial firepower. Each battle reduced the rebels' numbers. Each retreat consumed precious ammunition. Food became increasingly scarce. Medical supplies almost disappeared. Some former samurai began melting metal to repair damaged equipment. Others carefully collected cartridges from the battlefield because producing new ammunition had become nearly impossible. Despite these hardships, discipline remained remarkably strong. Saigō himself continued to share the same conditions as his followers. He did not surround himself with luxury. He marched with the men. He ate what they ate. He accepted the same dangers they faced every day. This earned him extraordinary loyalty. Many who fought beside him later wrote that they followed not simply because he was their commander, but because they believed he embodied the ideals of the samurai better than anyone else alive. Yet even the most respected leader could not change reality. The imperial army continued to grow stronger. By the summer of 1877, tens of thousands of government soldiers had been committed to crushing the rebellion. Many of these troops had never fought a real battle before the uprising. Now they were becoming experienced veterans. Ironically, the rebellion itself was helping create the modern Japanese army that would define the nation for decades to come. Historians often point to the Satsuma Rebellion as the final proof that Japan's new military system had succeeded. Only a few years earlier, many had questioned whether ordinary conscripts could ever defeat professional samurai. Now the answer was becoming unmistakably clear. They could. Not because individual soldiers were superior swordsmen, but because modern organization, logistics, firearms, and centralized command had transformed the nature of warfare. Across Japan, newspapers followed every stage of the conflict. Citizens watched as legends they had grown up admiring slowly disappeared from the battlefield. For centuries, the samurai had represented military excellence. Now an entirely different kind of army was taking their place. It was more modern, more flexible, and increasingly impossible to defeat. As casualties mounted, some rebels quietly wondered whether continuing the struggle still served any purpose. Saigō understood their despair. According to accounts from those close to him, he rarely encouraged unrealistic hope. He knew the odds. He knew the government's resources were overwhelming, yet surrender remained almost unthinkable. For many samurai, laying down their weapons would mean admitting that the world they had inherited no longer existed. It was not simply a military defeat. It was the end of an identity, the end of a way of life. By late summer, the rebel force had shrunk dramatically. Thousands had been killed. Others had been wounded or captured. The once proud army that marched from Kagoshima now consisted of only a few hundred exhausted survivors. Still, they refused to abandon their commander. Together they withdrew toward the hills surrounding Kagoshima, returning almost to where the rebellion had begun. There, overlooking the city they once called home, they prepared for one final stand. They knew reinforcements would not come. They knew victory was no longer possible. But according to those who remained, that was never the reason they continued fighting. For them, the battle ahead was no longer about winning a war. It was about deciding how history would remember the last generation of samurai. By September 1877, the rebellion had been reduced to a single mountain. The survivors gathered on the slopes of Shiroyama, overlooking Kagoshima Bay. There were no illusions left, no secret reinforcements, no hope of reversing the course of the war. The samurai who remained understood that this would almost certainly be their final battlefield. Saigō Takamori's army, which had once numbered in the thousands, had been reduced to only a few hundred exhausted men. Many were wounded. Many suffered from hunger. Ammunition had become dangerously scarce. Some fighters possessed only a handful of cartridges. Others carried little more than their swords. Across the valley stood an entirely different force. The imperial army had surrounded Shiroyama with overwhelming strength. Under the command of General Yamagata Aritomo, government forces numbered more than 30,000 soldiers. They constructed trenches. They raised earthworks. Artillery batteries were carefully positioned around the mountain. Escape routes were blocked. Every possible path was sealed. Unlike earlier battles, the government intended to leave nothing to chance. They had learned to respect their opponent. These were not ordinary rebels. They were highly trained warriors whose discipline had repeatedly surprised modern commanders. Even in defeat, they remained dangerous. For days, government engineers strengthened their positions. Heavy guns were moved into place. Warships anchored offshore added their firepower to the encirclement. The mountain became a prison. Every hour tightened the noose. Historians continue to debate the exact conversations that took place during those final days. Some later accounts claim that government officials hoped Saigō might surrender peacefully. Others suggest they knew he never would. What is well documented is that no agreement was reached. Neither side expected negotiations to change the outcome. Before dawn on September 24, 1877, the silence finally ended. Imperial artillery opened fire. Shell after shell crashed into the rocky slopes of Shiroyama. Explosions echoed across Kagoshima. Trees shattered. Earth and stone rained down upon the defenders. 4 hours, bombardment continued. It represented a form of warfare almost unimaginable during the great civil conflicts of earlier centuries. This was no longer the age of arrows and cavalry. Industrial firepower now dominated the battlefield. As daylight approached, infantry units began advancing uphill from multiple directions. Rifle volleys rolled across the mountain in disciplined succession. The defenders answered with whatever ammunition remained. Every shot mattered. Every cartridge was precious. Eventually, many samurai ran out of bullets. One by one, rifles fell silent. What remained were the weapons their ancestors had carried for generations. Katana, short swords, spears. The image of armored warriors charging through smoke toward rows of modern rifles has become one of the defining symbols of the rebellion. Yet reality was likely more complex than later legend suggests. Not every rebel carried a sword alone. Many continued using firearms whenever ammunition was available. The battle was chaotic, fought at extremely close range across rough terrain under relentless pressure. Still, there is little doubt that countless former samurai entered the final stages of the battle knowing they had almost no chance of survival. Saigō himself was seriously wounded during the fighting. Exactly how his life ended remains one of the most discussed questions in Japanese history. Traditional accounts often state that, after suffering severe injuries, he was assisted by loyal followers in performing seppuku, the ritual suicide associated with samurai honor. Other historians believe he may have died from his wounds before the ritual could be completed. Because eyewitness testimony is limited and sometimes contradictory, the precise details can no longer be known with certainty. What is clear is that Saigō Takamori did not survive the Battle of Shiroyama. With his death, organized resistance collapsed. The remaining rebels continued fighting until they were overwhelmed. By the end of the morning, the battlefield had fallen silent. The Satsuma Rebellion was over. The government had won. But the victory carried a deeper meaning than the defeat of one uprising. For centuries, the samurai had shaped Japan's politics, military, and identity. On the slopes of Shiroyama, that era effectively came to an end. The sword had not disappeared overnight. Samurai values would continue to influence Japanese society for generations. But never again would a hereditary warrior class determine the nation's future. A modern state had prevailed over a feudal tradition, and one man's final stand would become one of the most enduring symbols in Japanese history. When the guns finally fell silent at Shiroyama, the imperial government had achieved its objective. The Satsuma Rebellion was over. The last major resistance against the Meiji state had been crushed. From a military perspective, the outcome seemed undeniable. Modern Japan had defeated feudal Japan. The age of the samurai, as a political and military class, had come to an end. Yet history rarely remembers only the victors. Sometimes it remembers those who stood for something larger than victory itself. News of Saigō Takamori's death spread quickly throughout Japan. For many government officials, it marked the successful conclusion of a dangerous rebellion. But among ordinary citizens, the reaction was far more complicated. Even people who supported modernization often admired Saigō's character. He had never been known for greed. He had not fought to crown himself ruler. He had not sought wealth or personal power. Instead, he became a symbol of a painful question that every nation eventually faces. How much of the past should be sacrificed in order to build the future? That question did not disappear with his death. It continued to shape Japan as factories multiplied, railways expanded, and the country transformed into one of the world's fastest modernizing nations. The irony was impossible to ignore. Saigō Takamori had helped bring about the Meiji Restoration. Without his efforts to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate, the new government might never have risen to power. Yet only a few years later, he died fighting the very state he had helped create. History is filled with revolutions that eventually consume their own architects. Saigō's story became one of their most powerful examples. As the years passed, emotions surrounding the rebellion gradually softened. The government no longer viewed him solely as an enemy. Instead, he increasingly came to be seen as a tragic patriot, a man whose methods had been rejected, but whose sincerity was difficult to deny. In 1889, more than a decade after his death, Emperor Meiji officially granted Saigō Takamori a posthumous pardon. It was an extraordinary gesture. The man who had led the largest armed rebellion against the new government was formally restored to honor. The pardon did not erase the rebellion, nor did it suggest the government believed he had been right. Rather, it reflected a growing recognition that Saigō had acted from deeply held convictions about Japan's future, not from personal ambition. Today, one of the most famous statues in Tokyo stands in Ueno Park. It does not show Saigō dressed in magnificent armor. It does not portray him triumphantly raising a sword. Instead, he is shown walking calmly with his hunting dog. Simple, quiet, almost ordinary. The monument says something profound. Japan chose to remember not merely the warrior, but the man. Over time, Saigō's story spread far beyond Japan. Books, novels, and films introduced new audiences to the legend of The Last Samurai. Some adaptations captured elements of the historical events. Others blended fact with fiction, creating dramatic narratives inspired by his life rather than strictly following it. The image of a lone samurai standing against an unstoppable modern world became one of history's most enduring symbols. Yet the real story is even more compelling than many legends. Saigō Takamori did not fight because he hated change. He had once fought for change. What troubled him was the speed at which centuries of tradition seemed to disappear, and the fear that modernization might come at the cost of values he believed defined Japan. Modern historians continue to debate his decisions. Some argue the rebellion was destined to fail from the beginning and only delayed Japan's inevitable transformation. Others believe his resistance served as an important reminder that rapid progress often leaves parts of society behind. Perhaps both perspectives contain truth. That complexity is precisely why his story still resonates nearly 150 years later. The Battle of Shiroyama did not simply end one rebellion. It marked the conclusion of an era that had shaped Japan for centuries. The samurai class disappeared from political power, but many of the principles associated with Bushido, discipline, duty, perseverance, and loyalty, continued to influence Japanese culture, business, education, and military thought long after swords vanished from the battlefield. So, why did the last samurai choose death over surrender? Because to Saigō Takamori, surrender was never merely the loss of a battle. It meant abandoning the ideals that had defined his entire life. Whether one sees him as a hero, a rebel, or a tragic idealist, his final stand reminds us of a timeless truth. History is not shaped only by those who win. It is also shaped by those willing to lose everything for what they believe is right. And that is why, nearly a century and a half later, the last samurai is remembered not for how he died, but for what he refused to surrender.